Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your co-hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Kalik. Rania, great to be back with you.
Great to be back on with you, Eugene.
Well, listen, it's always a pleasure, and big shout out to everyone who is here in viewer land, as it were, whether you're on YouTube or watching us on Free Speech TV, and shout out to the whole FSTV team for making it possible for us to be seen there on your platform. And if you are watching on YouTube, just want to go ahead and remind you that this would be a great time to go ahead and hit the subscribe button, then hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things that you subscribe to. So that way you don't have to look long and far or go through any difficulty to be alerted right away to all the excellent content coming out here from Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Kalik. We've got a lot of great things coming up for you. We're going to be having a live election night show. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the show here. That will be next week, and all of our great and varied content. So hit subscribe, hit the bell. That way you can easily access it. Rania, are there other things you would like our audience to know?
Yes, Eugene, there's always a few things. I'm going to go down my list. Ready? Let's start with, I would very much like for those who are watching to make sure you smash that like button, you guys.
Smash that
it helps.
like button.
That's my voice. It helps boost us in the algorithm. It's super important. It's something you can do basically for free. You just got to click that thumbs up. But also for those who are able to, we are an independent media outlet. So, we don't have an endless supply of money from the weapons companies and pharmaceutical companies and various tech billionaires, like Peter Thiel, to just pump us full of money. We depend on your donations so that we can sustain ourselves and grow and keep bringing you quality journalism from an anti-imperialist perspective. So if you are able to, please consider becoming a member of Breakthrough News for as little as $5 a month, though you can give us more than that if you have it. Patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch, but most importantly, you'll become a part of an independent media movement. And there's the merch. Eugene is trying to Vanna White showcase you. You have to use your hands a little bit more, Eugene.
No.
Yeah, come on. Listen, if you guys donate $100 a month, Eugene will do a Vanna White hand gesture for the mug that he's showing you.
Perfect. I can agree to that. For $100 a month, not one time. You gotta get it together.
Yeah. It's gotta be like a monthly thing. But So hey, everybody consider it. Think about it. But anyways, but in all seriousness, I think this is a more important a time than any as we witness just how much we're lied to by a tsunami of propaganda about literally everything to try to invest in independent media and help it keep going and growing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's it really couldn't be more essential. And as we'll even be showing you here today on this show, I mean, there's so many different flashpoints, obviously everything that's happening in West Asia, particularly in Gaza, the ongoing genocide, but the rising tensions in Northeast Asia, which we'll be also talking about today, the ructions in Latin America, where there are quite a bit of positives, negatives, contradictions, things that need, a lot of analysis and context and framing to really understand the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, everything we see happening here, the hurricanes happening in the United States, we could go on and on. I think people can see how much is happening in our world, both good and bad, and how poorly it's being covered by the mainstream media, thus making the work that we do, and we're privileged to have the opportunity to do it, I think. That's how I feel, more and more important. So please support if you can. And big shout out to everyone who is already a patron. Your patronage has really gone a long way, undoubtedly further than you even know, to help keep us on air. But Rania, I think we can go ahead and get ready to turn to our first topic, and that is multiple things in Latin America. A lot going on. Bolivia, Brazil, Mexico. There's actually more going on than that, but we only have but so much time here to hit on all these different points. But we will hit at least the ones that I mentioned, and we'll see what happens. We are very honored to be joined once again by the multi-talented Zoe Alexandra, the editor of People's Dispatch. Zoe, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. It's always good to have you here. Well, let's start with one of the thornier issues in Latin America that I think a lot of people are outside of Latin America are struggling a little bit to understand exactly what's happening to the extent we know, which I know there's a lot of unknowns, and that is what's happening in Bolivia. I believe it was earlier this week there was an assassination attempt on former President Evo Morales, and there's quite a bit of rancor between Evo Morales and the current president, Luis Arce, and different elements of the movement towards socialism parties. So I don't know exactly where to start here, but maybe give us some framing, Zoe, on how to understand this.
Yeah, well, I just start off by saying that what happened on the morning of Sunday was really horrifying. It was, as you see in the video, an assassination attempt against former President Evo Morales. He was driving to his, I think every Sunday is a radio show. He was driving to the radio station, and he was in one car. There's another car in his kind of entourage. And at some point, non-uniformed armed men started to open fire at the cars. There were about, I think, over 14 bullet impacts. As you can see in the video, the driver was injured. Nobody else was injured. But again, I mean, when over 14 bullets hit a car, there's a clear intention to kill. That's undeniable, especially given who's traveling inside of that car. This incident provoked a widespread condemnation from political leaders across Latin America, really, really concerned for what happened. And, this assassination attempt takes place in a very complicated and tense moment in Bolivia. So, at the moment, there is a pretty extensive march and national mobilization called the Mobilization to Save Bolivia. This is a mobilization that was organized by political and social movement sectors close to former President Evo Morales. It was called for in a context of rising political tension. So there are some economic factors there, but largely this is a political struggle with allegations from, again, sectors close to Evo Morales alleging that Luis Arce is attempting to undermine these political sectors, attempting to block Evo Morales from being a candidate in the upcoming elections, and a general kind of reproach against his government. And so there's been, for people who have been following Bolivia, there has been growing tensions between these two political leaders who were, former allies, both from the movement towards socialism, MAS, YPSP. They, of course, united in the 2020 elections, which were called for after the coup that took Evo Morales out of office. There was a really, impressive joint and united struggle by progressive sectors in Bolivia following the coup, which Eugene and Rania presided over, that took place again from 2019 into 2020, where people were mobilizing constantly to demand that elections be held after the coup. And so in this moment of this mass mobilization, of united mobilization, Evo was in exile, and there was attempts on his life. And so there was a unitary decision that Luis Arce should run for presidency. He has been president again for the past 4 years. And essentially this tension has been brewing in the past year because, of course, elections are coming up. And the question is, who is the political figure that is going to be kind of the progressive candidate in these elections? There has been, again, intense political conflict between these two sectors. There have been attempts at mediation, and this has really boiled over into the political mobilization that we've been seeing for the past, I think it's 17 days with the March to Save Bolivia. And then, of course, an assassination attempt occurs in the middle of this high levels of political tension. And so, again, people are trying to understand what to make of this. There's a lot of different allegations taking place. On one hand, the Minister of Government, Eduardo del Castillo, has made some kind of a bit odd statements that have been seen by many as kind of not truthful. He said that Evo Morales at 6:30 in the morning sped through a police control point, a checkpoint, and that they started firing at police officers who then fired back. Evo Morales says that this was a planned assassination attempt against him, specifically ordered by Eduardo del Castillo. He also accuses Luis Arce of being involved in this. So again, it's still, we're just 4 days out from this very, very explosive moment, and there's still, Luis Arce called for an investigation into what happened. Evo Morales has demanded that several ministers from the government resign and that there be independent investigations carried out by ALBA and by CELAC. So, I think what's important to underscore in this very tragic and unfortunate episode is the possibilities for these sort of conflicts to open up. Of course, these two political sectors are also facing up against sort of a very fascist right wing that exists in Bolivia. We know that in 2019, there were fascist mobs that were on the streets in many places of Bolivia. We remember the images of Patricia Arce, who was dragged through the streets, scalped, got red paint thrown at her. There were so many horrifying images of exactly what this fascist sector in the country is capable of doing. And then, of course, culminating in the coup with Eugene and Rania swearing on the Bible. And so, on one hand, you have this existence of the fascist opposition. And then, of course, kind of the unfortunate struggle between these two sectors. And then when things like this happen, it's very difficult, I think, and there's been a lot of caution from, leaders across the region to kind of try to stay clear of inflaming the situation further. But I think it is really unfortunate because there's been sort of a tipping point in some senses. Was this a completely politically motivated assassination attempt? I think that's still being discussed. It's still being verified. There's still information to know, but I think what's very clear is that there's a very volatile political climate right now, and that hopefully this sort of political violence does not continue, because that is not good for anyone, not good for the Bolivian people, not good for the Bolivian left, not good for progressive movements in the country.
Well, Zoe, moving to a different part of Latin America, there was another recent development that I think took a lot of people by surprise. It's that Venezuela had applied, like many other countries in the region, to be part of the BRICS group, which Brazil is a part of course. And interestingly enough, Brazil intervened to block Venezuela from joining the BRICS group. And this was on the authority of Lula da Silva, who was considered to be somebody who was going to be like part of Pink Tide 2.0 after he won the presidency again, after basically being jailed because of the U.S. So can you explain to us what's going on here? What's happening with Brazil? And I'll also point out this has caused a diplomatic row between Venezuela and Brazil. And there's been tensions growing between the two countries, especially after the fascist coup attempt we witnessed in Venezuela. We were both there. After the re-election of President Maduro, when Brazil and a few other countries in the region participated in trying to undermine the election results with the U.S.
Yeah, well, again, as Eugene said before getting into this, it's been a kind of a wild week in Latin America. And before getting to kind of the depressing update, I just wanted to say very quickly that yesterday, Argentina voted for the resolution to condemn the blockade, and the foreign minister was promptly fired by Javier Milei. So just start off with a little interesting and funny note. And going into the situation with Brazil and Venezuela and the BRICS, it is, again, we're in this kind of very dynamic moment. And so this BRICS summit was held in Kazan, Russia last week. We know that in the past several meetings of the BRICS, one of the biggest points of discussion has been opening up BRICS to more countries. There has been a lot of interest from global South countries to be part of this alliance, precisely because of its intention and its ongoing projects to challenge U.S. monetary domination over financial systems, attempts to build alliances, trade alliances, economic projects, cooperation between countries of the global South. And so, of course, many Latin American countries who have been, strangled by whether it's U.S. sanctions or U.S. trade policy are very, very interested in this possibility. Notably, Argentina rejected BRICS membership. And so Venezuela was one of these countries that was invited to attend the BRICS summit in Kazan. Nicolas Maduro himself traveled there, which is noteworthy because, due to the bounty that the United States put on his head, he doesn't actually travel to a lot of global North countries. Of course, going to Russia is a different ballgame, but it's notable that he went in person. There's clearly a lot of interest from Venezuela to be part of this alliance. And when it was announced, the countries that would be kind of invited in a different tier of membership to be part of BRICS, Venezuela was not on that list. And it was later revealed that this was due precisely to from a decision by Lula da Silva and by people within the foreign ministry, Itamaraty. This decision is, again, very controversial, and it has been rejected by large parts of the Brazilian left who feel like this is completely against, what the kind of world that Lula da Silva says that he's building, challenging U.S. imperialism, challenging U.S. well, not imperialism, he wouldn't say that, but challenging U.S. domination. I co-host a weekly show with Barricada TV and De Raiz, and we spoke to Breno Altman, who's a Brazilian journalist, and he was telling us that kind of the three main reasons that Lula made this decision is, one, to punish Venezuela. Lula feels that the way that the elections were carried forward in Venezuela were, to his view, not as promised to him. He said, his members of his government said that they were given certain promises and certain assurances about how Venezuela would carry forward their elections. And then they claim that those were not fulfilled. The certain electoral data was not released. And so they say, oh, now you want to join the alliance that we're part of? No, thanks. We're gonna block that. Another reason that Breno had shared with us is that for Brazil, they see Venezuela as a possibility to kind of bargain with the United States and the European Union. Lula and Itamaraty has been moving closer to these very important regional players, the European Union and the United States. They really want to have good relations with this. I think it's important to remember that Brazil is not a socialist project. It is a government, it is a coalition government, which has right-wing sectors, which has big business sectors that actually are very interested in maintaining strong and friendly relationships with the United States and with the European Union. So there is a suspicion that kind of turning its back on Venezuela was seen as kind of a way to get in good favor of their global North allies. And also in terms of domestic politics, of turning away from Venezuela and making their coalition partners happy and trying to have an advantage in the local elections, which turns out the PT actually did quite not well. So that was sort of a miscalculation in some senses. But I think that it's really important to understand the character of the Lula government and the role of Brazil within the region, but also with regards to the global North. They are not Venezuela, they are not Cuba, and they have a very different sort of way of relating to these different blocs.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a little unfair, but last 2 minutes here. Quickly, news coming out of Mexico. We'll obviously have to bring you back to talk about this more. 8 of the 11, I believe, Supreme Court justices saying they will not run for re-election or election in the upcoming elections that are part of the judicial changes brought in by the Morena party. Quickly, your thought. I mean, that seems good to me, right? I mean, in a way, like these right-wing judges sort of taking themselves out of the game.
Yeah, well, this is a fun little rapid fire tour along Latin America. And yes, as we know, the judicial reform was passed in Mexico. This was historic. It really challenged the strong economic interest of this kind of judicial elite, which AMLO had spoken about a lot in promoting this judicial reform. And part of the judicial reform involves making all of judges elected by popular vote. And so this was, again, widely rejected, largely by the same people that were actually appointed and receiving all of these benefits by having been appointed by political allies. And so now kind of they're bowing out and saying, all right, you're going to change the rules, but we're not going to play the game, which again is not a bad thing, because these are the exact people that they were targeting with the judicial reform and saying, you've been in these positions because you're appointed. Many of us will kind of feel the same way about the Supreme Court in the United States. You shouldn't have these privileges. These privileges were not bestowed to you by the people. The people should be the ones who kind of grant that power, grant that privilege to be able to serve in this position. We know that there's also extremely good economic benefits to having these positions. That has also been changed. And so now they're kind of saying, all right, this is no longer strategic for me. And so when there is an election of judges, it's likely that it will have a sort of different, perhaps class component, and actually hopefully be able to achieve exactly what was the goal of the judicial reform, which is actually having a fair, a just system that represents and is able to work in favor of the majorities and their interests, instead of favoring corporates, favoring elites, and favoring the ruling class of the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can go more in depth on all these issues and many more at peoplesdispatch.org, peoplesdispatch.org. You are the editor of People's Dispatch. Zoe Alexandra, thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side. Thanks
so much for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eugene, that was depressing.
Rania. Yeah.
That was just, what am I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a tough
I'll just
time.
leave it. I'm just going to take a sip of water. I'm going to take a sip of water so I don't say anything else.
Stay hydrated. That's honestly sometimes the most important thing. Well, we want to turn to another very, very important issue, one that's being put out here in the media quite a bit, at least allegations regarding military relations between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, and Russia vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. But of course, that also spills over into the broader attempt to saber rattle by the United States against North Korea in Northeast Asia. So to help us sort through all these various different things, we are very happy to be joined once again on the show by Jamie Tyberg, who's an organizer with Nodutdol. Jamie, thank you so much for being back with us.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you here. And, I maybe want to start slightly. I mean, there's a lot to be said about, the DPRK-Russia and the different things, but I wanted to start maybe just from a framing perspective, because there's so many articles about this in the Western media. There's 8,000, there's 10,000, there's all these troops. They're fighting in Ukraine. They're going to Ukraine. And it's all reported as if it must be true because the U.S. and the Ukrainians said so, even though there's no satellite images, there's no corroboration. And it just feels like that's an important part of this entire story, is how, at least in the West, it seems you can say almost anything about DPRK and it's just immediately believed, regardless of what evidentiary reality is there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you're saying, every major Western news outlet reported on this before they could present any sort of evidence. I think in the past week, though, there have been some claims and the publishing of satellite images, but the reality is that, again, they reported on these claims before they could prove anything, and then the claims alone had the public's attention as being true. And this is largely because the West owns and operates the majority of media and news channels in the world. So they have monopoly on what conversations people are having and how they're framing those conversations. And the DPRK isn't their only target in doing this. Any claims about any country made by the West becomes uncontested truth that they can then use to further their escalations and justify. I mean, most famously, their claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction justified their invasion and war and still the ongoing escalation in the region. But I think the timing is more interesting because the election is in mere days. And they've really been ramping up media coverage of this in the past week or so. And Trump and Kamala Harris have been divided on the issue of Ukraine. And Trump has, in fact, said that he wants NATO to foot the bill on this war. But by claiming that a third party, specifically the DPRK, which is an easy target for Western audiences, has entered the battlefield on Russia's side, opens up the situation for Ukraine to explicitly request troops from its allies. So it's diabolically strategic because it's a sensational safeguard for the US to protect their plans to expand NATO into Western Europe in the case that Trump wins. Because, again, Trump may reduce the military aid going to Ukraine, which so far, from 2014 to 2022, has totaled more than 90 billion in US dollars. And so they're fueling escalations between the DPRK and the ROK at the same time that they're ensuring their plans to expand NATO.
I mean, that's just such an insane amount of money you just said. But, you know, if we're going to assume the story is true, right? Like, let's just be generous to them for a moment. Wouldn't it seem incredibly hypocritical that the US media and US politicians are losing their mind and, like, you know, in like a panicked sweat about DPRK-Russia defense cooperation when you juxtapose that with the fact that South Korea and the US have this insanely high level of cooperation on war matters? Like, it's like, why is it okay for it to be this way and not this way sort of situation?
I mean, for us, the US-RK cooperation itself is a provocation of war because their cooperation is not some innocent partnership between two nations. The US uses South Korea as a strategic war base for domination of the Asia-Pacific region, just as they use Israel for that same purpose in the Middle East. And now their cooperation has reached a point where tensions on the peninsula are at unprecedented levels. And let's actually compare the two, right? The DPRK and Russia did sign a mutual defense treaty last year. And in it, they pledged mutual aid to each other if either country faces aggression. But on the other hand, if you look at the alliance between the ROK and the US, the South Korean military is under wartime operational control of the US military. So that means if war were to break out, all South Korean troops would be under US command. And it's even more hypocritical because there have always been foreign troops in Ukraine. Even earlier this February, the German chancellor said that there were British and French forces in Ukraine. Last October, the US also admitted to having forces in Ukraine as well. But now that there is these claims of DPRK being involved in conflict, there's massive coverage. And the ROK in particular benefits from these claims because now with the use of the DPRK being involved, the ROK is saying we're going to sell weapons to Ukraine. And exporting lethal weapons to Ukraine would be a boost to the ROK's rapidly expanding arms manufacturing sector. It also increases their prestige and value within the imperialist bloc. And the South Korean president currently is facing multiple crises. There's a citizens' referendum for his impeachment. There's also outrage over the failure of prosecutors to indict the first lady for stock manipulation. And so manufacturing this sort of international crisis where he can emerge as some sort of hero shores up his political legitimacy.
I really appreciate that you brought up the issue of the DPRK-Russia Mutual Defense Treaty, because I feel so much of the sort of DPRK-Russia relations is like this is just some like evil military war alliance. But I mean, it seems to me in both Putin's visit to DPRK, also Kim Jong-un going to Russia, different things like that, that there's a more wide-ranging element of their cooperation, sort of based on where both countries are right now. And I was wondering, if you could give us some context on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The two countries are neighbors, they share a border, and they're not aligned with the US imperialism. So they have historically had decent relations. In 2000, they signed a treaty called the Treaty of Friendship, Good Neighborliness, and Cooperation. And the Mutual Defense Treaty that they recently signed is definitely a new stage in their partnership between the two countries. Now, we don't know the details of this agreement because it wasn't made public, but in press announcements, they have said that the agreement aims to achieve a new multipolar world. And it's also important to remember that this agreement is emerging from extremely hostile conditions that the US has created in that region. The US has been pushing for an agreement between South Korea, Japan, and the US. Now, this agreement escalates openly against Russia and the DPRK, and Putin has said this joint military exercises between Japan, South Korea, and the US undermine peace and stability in the region. And Japan and Russia in particular they share waterways and have disputed islands. And in terms of nuclear weapons, I mean, the DPRK only has them as a measure of self-defense, and they developed their nuclear programs in response to the US's ongoing provocations. The US was, again, the first to even introduce nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula, and still remains the only country in history to have used nuclear weapons.
Oh, Rania, you're muted.
I have to do this at least once every show. Sorry.
Yes.
Every time. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. So going back to what we're discussing, it's often presented as some sort of crazy idea that the US should negotiate with the DPRK or like want to forge a path towards peace. But, for the average person in the US, specifically like working in oppressed people, is a war drive really in their interest?
Right. I mean, we have to also remember that it's the US in particular that's been the one to sabotage any peaceful efforts to reunification that the DPRK has consistently pursued on the peninsula. And so the fact that we're even at the level of tension that we are on the peninsula is because the US has sabotaged all of those peaceful efforts. And the US government spends an estimated $1.5 trillion annually on war, and is also one of the world's largest weapons producers and exporters. In 2023, South Korea followed and became the world's third largest export market for US weapons. And of course, US war profiteers like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin are heavily involved in the construction of new weapon systems in South Korea. And so any sort of escalation or like how close we are becoming to nuclear war in Korea is because the US has an economic interest in it. And it really drives their imperialist aims to be able to control every corner of this world. And I think more urgently, the US military is the greatest institutional polluter. And that has impacts not only today with the extremely active hurricane season that we saw this past year, but that those impacts are going to last through the next several generations. So it's really in nobody's interest, either today or in the future, except for the ruling class.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jamie, I know that at Nodutdol, y'all are doing a lot to educate and activate people around these issues. Where can they find you all and find your work?
Yes. You can learn more about our campaign at usoutofkorea.org. That has our demands, and it will start being updated with our campaign activities. And you can also follow us on social media at Nodutdol on Instagram and Twitter or X.
Right on. Thank you so much, as always, Jamie Tyberg with Nodutdol for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Rania?
Wow, it's just like, it's so interesting how these numbers that you hear, like, 90 billion spent on Ukraine, or like at 1.5 trillion that the US spends on basically war and military every single year. It's just such an insane amount of resources to invest in destruction and control of everything, and that I can't even really wrap your mind around it properly. But yeah, I mean, the level of I don't know, just obstacle to anything good in the world because of this imperialist military obsession by the US is pretty crazy.
Yeah, the level of militarism is just, it feels like a level of insanity, honestly. I mean, and I almost hesitate to say that because it just feels like it's, disrespectful to those who have mental illness to even say it, because it's just, it's in a world of its own, what's happening here. I mean, the $1.5 trillion, you think, I mean, that's more than almost all the rest of the government combined, just about. And when you look at the way it's sort of put forward, we're putting more, and we're doing just wild things. I mean, nuclear weapons are so powerful, but for some reason we need thousands of them, even if you had a scenario with a nuclear war, if you would never even get to use all those weapons. You wouldn't even use.
We'd all die.
You wouldn't
We'd all
even
be
use
dead.
a fifth of those weapons, for the Earth would be completely destroyed. But they're still spending $1 trillion to re-up, and they say, quote unquote, modernize the U.S. nuclear arsenal, the so-called nuclear triad: land, sea, and air. And it's just like, what is going on? And you look every year. This is something people should look up, and I just mentioned it before we turn to our next guest. Every year, Congress, for the past 4 or 5 years, I believe, Congress has in fact voted more money for the military than the military itself asked for. Like, they were like, we don't actually even need all that money. And they said, so we're going to give you extra money anyway. And you look at these things like the F-35, that'll cost about $1.7 trillion over its lifetime. The plane does not work correctly. And it just look it up. Again, this is another one of the things you can look up. Look, F-35 doesn't work. Just Google that, and you're going to be shocked. It does not work. You had the littoral combat ship, which is supposed to be the new era of the Navy. I believe they've actually just totally scrapped the project, even though they'd spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on it, because the ships didn't really work the way they were supposed to. The F-22, which is the plane they rolled out at the same time as the F-35, notice you never really hear anything about the F-22 anymore, and I'll just leave it to people to Google and find out why that may be, but that didn't turn out the way it was supposed to as well. So, it's an amazing thing. I'd like to say it's shocking, but you get used to it, but it is still outrageous to see how much is going on. And I'll end here. My dad used to live in Hampton, Virginia, near Hampton Roads, and before 9/11, you could go on the military bases, and you see how these generals are living in these giant mansions. They have servants who are enlisted people who are maids and waiters and stuff like that. They've got their own officers' golf courses, their own beaches. So it's not even just the weapons. We're actually also paying for the officer corps, especially at its highest level, to have a 100 millionaire, billionaire style existence, because they also fly around on their own jets and stuff like that. So they're actually living like the richest people. And then, of course, when they get tired and want to retire, like General Lloyd Austin, they just go and join the board of Raytheon, and they live the exact same way, on the dime of the military contractors. So it's quite a scenario.
Are you saying that they don't end up like Yahya Sinwar, fighting to the last breath on the front lines at the age of 60?
You know what? I think I am saying that, believe it or not. They are leading from behind. There's no doubt about that.
Wow.
On that note, since we were also just talking about Ukraine, let's stick with that topic, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Very happy to be joined as we continue the show here by the host of the Socialist program here on Breakthrough News, Brian Becker. Brian, thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be here.
Well, great to have you. And, in a way, because of everything that's happening in West Asia, I feel Ukraine has kind of fallen out of the news a little bit, although there's obviously still a lot going on there. And so while it's been going on for so long. I want to start with maybe what seems like a basic question is, what is this war really about? I mean, we're pouring almost $100 billion. I mean, innumerable numbers of people on both sides are dying. I mean, it's such a huge conflict, but I feel that there's always sort of a murkiness. It's like freedom, good. It's just generally good. But I mean, how did we get here? What is this conflict really about?
Yeah, well, just very quickly, and for people who might have been tuning in for the first time and not really hearing the history, because I know both of you have covered the history somewhat in the past, or extensively, in fact, the U.S. Orchestrated a coup d'etat with armed fascist militias against a democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014, in February 2014. And the government that was overthrown had pledged that Ukraine would be neutral, that they would not join NATO, that Ukraine would be a neutral country and have good relations with Russia and good relations with the West, meaning Europe, NATO, and the United States. And the U.S. toppled that government. Victoria Nuland, who had been Hillary Clinton's spokesperson when she became Secretary of State, was actually in downtown Kiev helping to organize the protests. So was John McCain from the Republican Party. There was an agreement signed between the Yanukovych government and the protesters. And Yanukovych said, okay, we're going to withdraw the police from Maidan. We're going to try to we're going to meet you halfway. We're going to have early elections. We're going to decentralize power. Let's try to find a way to end this stalemate, because the protests have been going on for months. The next day after they withdrew the police, the U.S. supported fascist militias, and I'm using that language accurately and precisely, not rhetorically or with any embellishment. Those fascist forces stormed the parliament. The president fled for his life. And that began a process whereby the Ukrainian government was essentially captured by the United States. And Ukraine was going to be moved into NATO. And then Russia would have Ukraine in NATO and all of the advanced missiles, including nuclear missiles, as you talked about just now, the two of you, about the danger of a new generation of nuclear weapons. They were going to be positioned on Russia's very long border with Ukraine. And those missiles had a flight time of 6 minutes to their target, meaning missiles that Russia could never defend against. So if you think this movie started on February 2022, when Russia actually invaded, and ignore what happened in February 2014, you're coming in at the end of the movie. And for anybody who comes in at the end of the movie, you don't know the plot. You have to go back to the origin of the story. And so we see this machination by the United States to carry out regime change in Ukraine, which was the second largest republic in the Soviet Union, a sister republic for Russia, a country where most of the people spoke Russian, a country where Kiev was at one time the capital of Russia. That was the old imperial Russia. In other words, two countries that were very close. And now Ukraine became a colony, essentially, of the United States. And in 2022, Putin had said to the United States, we have a red line. We're not going to allow Ukraine to be part of NATO. He amassed troops at the border in Belarus and in the Russian-Ukrainian border, 100,000 of them, and said, you better negotiate with us, to which Anthony Blinken and Biden and Jake Sullivan said, Russia's demands are non-starters. So Russia moved in, and yes, they fired the first shot in February 22, but that wasn't the first shot. The first shot was actually February 2014. So now we have a situation where I think the big story here, Rania and Eugene, is that the Ukrainians are running out of warm bodies to send to the front. So they've expanded the conscription. They're now sending conscription gangs to basically kidnap Ukrainian men to conscript another 160,000 people to send to the front line, because they've run out of human bodies. Hundreds of thousands of people on both sides have been killed or wounded. It's a terrible tragedy. It needs to end. It could end. And the way it could end is the United States could meet Russia halfway and say, guess what? We agree with you. Ukraine can be a neutral country. What would be wrong with that? Austria was neutral after World War II. Finland had been neutral. Other countries are neutral. The U.S. is acting like a neutral country is somehow a threat to the U.S. empire, which is, it shows the gangster-like attitude by the United States, you cannot profess neutrality. Neutrality is considered an evil deed on the part of the empire. You must pledge fidelity to the empire. And that, in essence, is what this war is about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I appreciate that you used the word gangster, because I think that when we look at what the U.S. is willing to do, I think we've learned over the last year just how depraved. I mean, not that anybody's too surprised with the depravity of the U.S. and its proxy, Israel in the Middle East, but it's certainly really pushing the envelope beyond anything we've seen, I think, in our lifetimes, and just the level of horrific genocidal violence they're willing to inflict to basically just dominate everything. And you mentioned something about the fact that Ukrainians are running out of bullets or guns or whatever it may be, some sort of equipment, right?
Human
So I
bodies.
guess, I'm sorry, human bodies, but I actually wanted to take it to the issue of equipment as well, because the U.S. is a very powerful force in the world, and it spends an insane amount of resources. Me and Eugene were just talking about before we started this segment, the amount of resources the U.S. spends on imperialism, on militarism, but it's not infinite. And so at some point, you know, maybe the U.S. isn't overstretched yet, but there's this insane war happening in Ukraine to try to bleed the Russians. There's this insane amount of resources the U.S. is pouring into Israel to genocide Gaza and now expand its horrific atrocities into Lebanon and perhaps even Iran at some point soon, with just warships and literally like an endless supply of bombs and bullets. The U.S. is still militarizing around the South China Sea. It's still pouring weapons into Taiwan. The U.S. is still messing around in Latin America. I mean, I guess this is a really big question that you probably can't answer in 5 minutes, Brian, but like, at what point is this empire overstretched to an extent that it would be too weak to actually get its way everywhere? Because right now it kind of feels like the U.S. keeps getting its way and just keeps pushing the envelope and keep seeing that they can keep getting their way the more violent they are, at least in this moment in time.
Well, I'd answer it this way. I think it's overstretching the resources of the country such that the needs of working class people can't be met. But it's not overstretched from the point of view of capitalist corporations who actually are making huge amounts of money from endless war. So when you think about the spending on Ukraine, the $160 billion that has spent on Ukraine, most of that money doesn't go to Ukraine. Most of that money never leaves the United States. Those are government checks basically written to Boeing and to all of the other war contractors. So what's actually happening is, under the pretext of national defense, the capitalist government is taking taxpayers' dollars and funneling that money to capitalist corporations who have, guaranteed contracts and guaranteed profits. They don't have to compete in the capitalist marketplace. These are certain kinds of commodities that are exempt from the risk of the marketplace because the government guarantees the profit. Now, in North Carolina right now, Rania, in Asheville, one of our comrades is down. A couple of our comrades are down there doing relief for the people who got wiped out by the two hurricanes. One of them is there's a hotel that's temporarily housing 200 military veterans. These are people who have lost their homes. They don't have flood insurance. They don't have wind insurance. They're stuck in a motel for the next 6 months. There's no clean water. And at the same time that the government says it can't do anything to rescue the people in Asheville, North Carolina, it is sending $160 billion to Ukraine. Now, people might say, and some of the right-wing agitators say, well, we should spend money on people at home, not on those Ukrainians. But the money is actually not going to the Ukrainians. The money is going to the capitalist corporations that make up the military-industrial complex. In other words, rich Americans are getting this money. The Ukrainians pay a price because it's their people dying in a proxy war, and working class folks in the United States, like these 200 veterans stuck in a hotel in Asheville, they're paying the price. So the war has an enormous cost. It's overstretching the lives of the American people, the people of the United States, the working class people. I mean, the rising tide of homelessness, the fact that childhood poverty doubled again after having been reduced by 50% because of COVID emergency relief. It doubled again when the government said, well, the COVID emergency is over, so we're cutting all these aid programs to families. At the same time, they increased the U.S. military budget by $200 billion. So the empire is overstretching the lives of the people of the United States and the people around the world. So we have to look at this from a class point of view. This is a rich man's war in Ukraine. It's a rich man's war in Palestine. The U.S. ruling class, as you said, they use Israel as a proxy. But all those bombs, those 2,000-pound bombs, that's good business for American bomb makers. You know, they bombed 10 cities in Gaza. Well, that's good business because now Israel can order more bombs and American taxpayers can pay for those bombs. So we're in a class contract. We have to look at war and empire and imperialism from the framework of class. And by that, I mean that the imperialists represent a class, the capitalist class in the Western countries that are making huge profits from endless war, occupation, and looting and plundering other people's labor and resources. And the people who pay the price first and foremost are the victims, mainly in the global South, but also U.S. working class folks who are told by the U.S. government, sorry, we just don't have the resources to bail you out. And that's the reality of the current situation. I wanted to make one more comment, if I could.
Please.
If it's all right. You know, I watched your amazing segment right before this with Jamie from Nodutdol. You know, isn't it something that if it's true that thousands of North Korean troops are poised to fight with Russia, when you think back to 1950 in the Korean War, it was a marker where all the countries that supported North Korea were Russia, China, the East European socialist governments, and then on the other side were all the imperialists. And even though the fight now between Russia and Ukraine is not about communism and socialism, because the Soviet Union was destroyed and the Communist Party that existed in both Ukraine and Russia, Unified Communist Party, that's been destroyed. Even though that's gone, the imperialist drive for super profits just is endless. So in a way, the Cold War masked this war, this imperialist war drive with ideology, the fight against communism, when in fact, even when the communist issue isn't really the pressing topic, you still have the same dynamic war drive. It's a class war by imperialism, and it's been a class war for decades. And that's why working people in the United States have to say no. Trump, Harris, no. The war drive, no. International solidarity, that's what we have to be fighting for.
No, I think it's a tremendously good point. They said we were going to get a peace dividend when the Cold War ended, and instead we got the exact opposite under President Bill Clinton. Well, as always, Brian, really appreciate you having the opportunity or being willing to join us here on the freedom side. Everyone should be checking out the Socialist program. Yesterday's episode was pretty good. I'll let you see who was on the show with Brian, but might be worth it.
We had an amazing guest.
I think so. I think it'd be worth it checking it out after this show. Check it out, Socialist program.
I've heard of him before. Name starts with an E.
Well, anyway, the topic of the show is what will happen if Trump wins. And I think it's a really important assessment. And Eugene per year, so it's not an inside joke. Eugene was actually our guest, and it's really an amazing interview with tremendous historical perspective and insight. I hope people get a chance to watch it.
No, I appreciate that, and thank you for having me on. And every Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the Socialist program. Brian Becker, thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, gosh, when are we going to get to that point where the U.S. is like, all right, we've run out, guys. That was our last bullet.
Yeah, well.
We have no more bullets.
We shall see. We shall see.
Never gonna happen.
Yeah, probably. I mean, especially coming from the United States, we got so many bullets and so many guns that we had a long time for that happens. This is the ammunition capital of the world, man.
There's more guns than people.
Yeah, well, there's a big drama actually right now in the business world. I won't stay in this too long, but an Austrian company, I believe it's Austrian company, I think it might be 6 Hour, is trying to buy, I think it was Remington Arms, one of the big military gun and ammunition companies in America. Some people are trying to stop it because they're saying that a great American gun company shouldn't be owned by a European company. But the way, I think it is 6 Sauer, but I might be wrong. The way they're pushing back is they're like, no, this is good. This is good for America. Yes, we're European, but we're going to use the facilities to make more bullets for Ukraine. And we're all united around Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. So we're coming together. So you can see it's even being used in mergers and acquisitions, everything that's happening in Ukraine. But that's a little bit of an aside. As the cover image for this show said, will Gaza haunt Harris? We are not too many days away from the election here in the United States for president, and certainly there are many, many people of all races, backgrounds, faiths who are very, very angry over the genocide in Gaza, and very well, and I think likely will take to the polls in large numbers and may even cost Harris the election. But to talk more about all of this, we were very, very honored to be joined here once again on the show by Dr. Hassan Abdel Salam, who is the director of the Abandon Harris campaign. As always, Doctor, great to have you with us.
Amazing to reconnect. I hope you're both doing well.
Well, let me just start by asking you this. I mean, here we are a few days before the election. I mean, just give me a sense of what you all are hearing in the Abandon Harris campaign. I mean, you've been working for many, many months now since it was Abandon Biden, and a large number of people of all backgrounds have really come behind your banner here. 5 days out, or I think it's 5 days, what are you hearing on the ground about, well, voters who are really excised about the ongoing genocide?
There are 5 days left in this election. This is our destiny, November 5th. We've been building since November. We issued an ultimatum October 27th to the president calling for a ceasefire by October 31st. We observed that day. That will happen tomorrow, a year exactly, ceasefire deadline day. We commemorate that day, a day in which Abandon Biden emerged, a day in which we said clearly that we vow to actively campaign against the president because of the genocide, because he didn't declare the end of this violence committed at the hands of our government. And we now have campaigns across the nation in all of the swing states. I now, talking to you from the University of Michigan, here in the state of Michigan, living in Dearborn nearby, I can tell you that we have won this debate, that we are campaigning in the mosques and community centers and grocery stores, cafes, and we have won this debate. People all around this state tell us that they will never side with the criminals. The two major political candidates, the ones who engage in genocide and the ones who claim they will finish the job, we have rejected them overwhelmingly. People are doing as we recommend, to vote for Jill Stein, a candidate of peace, a candidate of goodness, a candidate of courage, a candidate who was arrested because she fought against the genocide, a moment of conscience. This country, a historic moment will happen in this election. We are really encouraged. From the start, our strategy has been to punish the vice president, formerly the president, because of the genocide, to then take the blame for the defeat, and in so doing, buy power to send a signal to the political landscape that you should never have ignored us, and such that genocide will never again be on the ballot. We have the numbers. Our data show we only need 70,000 voters in Michigan, 10,000 in Wisconsin, in Arizona, in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, 10,000 in all these states, to ensure that the vice president loses these states, that she doesn't win Michigan. And in losing Michigan, she loses the White House because of the genocide. Forever, it will be remembered. It will be the first time in history peacefully that we depose genociders at the hands of people of conscience in a peaceful means. And we ask all Americans to join us to defeat genocide, forever to be known that we came out, we walked gently to the ballot box behind the curtain and spoke the truth against the pharaohs in the White House.
So the last time that we had you on, I had asked you about, this talking point that we often hear from those who say, no, you need to suck it up and vote for Democrats because otherwise Trump will win, right? You're taking votes. I mean, there's two things here. There's like an entitlement. People feel entitled. Democrats are like somehow entitled to the Arab and Muslim vote. And therefore, by voting for a third party, somehow it's a vote for Trump, even though Trump doesn't get that vote, the third party candidate gets that vote. And you all are not endorsing or saying people should vote for Trump. However, the reality is that Michigan is in fact a swing state, and a lot of the states you mentioned are swing states. So if people are too angry to vote for Democrats, there's a high chance that Trump could win. And I think it's important to note that, if Trump does win the election, it's not like it's game over there, because organizing against genocide needs to continue, because genocide will have continued. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to speak to that potential outcome. Let's say Kamala Harris loses, Democrats are punished for their support for genocide. That means Trump will likely win if that happens, right? What then? Because I think a lot of people are asking that question. What happens next then if Trump's president?
And let me be completely transparent that by punishing the Democrat, the likelihood is that Trump will become the president. We were in despair during the time when Trump was president. I would close my laptop. I would not be able to hear him talk about Latino judges and people living with disabilities, and his spewing of racism and the despicable candidate that he is waiting in the corridors. Our assessment has been that when you commit genocide, you have passed a threshold of no return. There is no lesser evil. Genocide is considered the greatest crime in human rights that can be committed between human beings. There is no milder genocide. There is no gentle genocider that comes in the form of Kamala Harris. In fact, her very tears, crying when she hears and learns about the attacks and killings, and yet by her own hand, killing those very people that she cries about, is the height of doublespeak, the scariest imprimatur of evil that must be rejected. There is one candidate that just tells you in your face, and the other that comes beloved, coming in sympathy, and yet killing your own people. The former president prevented our family, friends, and colleagues from entering the country, but the vice president killed them. Fundamental justice, the value of life, commits us to ensuring that a defeat must happen. It's an argument based on sacrifice. 4 years under any Republican is incomparable to 1 day in Gaza. And what we have here is a long-term struggle against a regime, an autocracy. This regime is an autocracy. Biden and Harris have committed genocide. Tens of thousands of tons of bombs have fallen upon a people, raining their munitions, falling, killing, and innocent people on the verge of disintegration. And what do? They ask us for our vote while they send billions to complete the annihilation of a people who have never done anything wrong to the American people. And so what we believe is that if we were to go and walk and reward the vice president, what will it mean for the future of America? That we're presented with one of those terrifying dilemmas, a moral dilemma for which we believe has a clear answer. We must punish the vice president to ensure that everyone knows genocide is evil, and that leads to the defeat of those who engage in these policies, because in so doing, a reckoning will come to the Democratic Party and a reorientation in the Republican. I could tell you something curious that people didn't know in November. The Republicans run after Ben and Harris all the time now, asking for our endorsement, and we will never give it. But this shows our leverage. Imagine what it means when we defeat the vice president. They'll see us as serious and never want us to run back to the Democratic Party. And so what we see is that we are in a struggle. We may, again, commit to ourselves an ultimatum against the president if it's Trump, and we will fight and we will struggle and ensure their defeat in the midterms. And we will make it known that they too will fall at our hands. But we should never, ever feel demoralized and think that we don't have the capacity. Isn't it extraordinary that we could be known for the first time in the history of the world that peacefully we came out victorious by ensuring the defeat of a genocider, the signal it sends to the entire political landscape, whereas its alternative is this vision of a world in which the Republicans then look upon us and say, well, then I could do whatever I want. The Democrats following suit.
No, I think that's an incredibly important point, and I think the point you were making about a protracted struggle is also key because, one of the things I think is notable about the work you all have done, and I think it's also a carryover from the general movement of solidarity with the Palestinian people, is the level of diversity. I mean, in some ways I feel like people say, oh, this is just an Arab and Muslim issue, but I did some back of the envelope calculations the other day. Well over 100,000 African Americans who told the New York Times, if you take the percentages from the numbers, that their number one issue was the doing something about the genocide in Gaza. And so, I mean, this is a movement that I think is bringing together people in a way that reminds me of the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, what we saw in 2020, what we saw at Ferguson, of these very diverse strains of people coming together to try to create a new moral center in American politics, which seems crucial.
Absolutely. We see people from all walks and backgrounds, people of conscience. The American people have an amazing heart. We see in polling overwhelmingly people are for a ceasefire. They're for a full arms embargo. They believe this is a genocide. What has arrested progress has been that the Democratic Party, people are fearful of the alternative. The question is not whether we have folks that are side by side crying with us. When I share my story of being tortured, detained at the hands of the Israeli intelligence in Jerusalem, the moment in which I tell people my company, a toilet hole in the ground, the stench evident, my heart rate increasing, I hear the interrogators, the clanking of the keys behind the two metallic doors, the questioning, the interrogation, sleep deprived, attacked, constantly in pain. All I see are people, African Americans, Latinos, Gen Z, progressives in the audience, cleaning their tears under their eyes. And I come with a message, and what they ask me, filled with worry, a sense of responsibility, is the direction of this country. And so what I want to tell each of you is that this debate has been won. The question is, what are the steps we take as we move forward in this particular election? And we find people of sympathy, people of empathy who come and tell us, I've had enough. I've been told constantly to vote for the Democrats. We've been on a slippery slope. And every time they tell us, you must vote for us, because otherwise the alternative, which only enables them a greater opening to commit evil. And so at some point, we have to hunker down and become the blockade of conscience. And that's what I'm hearing by people all across the nation. Remember that we only need a few votes to ensure that these states swing away from the vice president. Why is it neck and neck? Why is it neck and neck? It's because people from all backgrounds, not just Muslim Americans that are less than 1% of the country, are coming out and voting against the vice president. This is a moment that will be remembered forever. At Abandon Biden, Abandon Harris, we always say that we follow the light of Martin Luther King, a man who took such great sacrifice, who was attacked. And we don't just remember the Martin Luther King who sung songs, "We shall overcome" on that Selma Bridge, or that penned the letters in a Birmingham jail, but that Martin Luther King, a year from his assassination, who spoke out against the Vietnam War and broad American international intervention. I look at the faces of my African-American brothers, Latinos, progressives, and I see the past repeating. We fought against Jim Crow, segregation, our ancestors, our forefathers and foremothers. It was tough, and people told us that we had no other options. Rosa Parks was seen as a person who should never act with courage because people wondered why. And that letter, a Birmingham jail, do people know why our beloved Martin Luther King wrote it? It was directed at white moderates who said, wait, don't. You're going a little ahead of yourself. There's all these other risks. And I'm here to tell you the same thing from my jail in Jerusalem to my fellow Americans. There is no time to wait when it comes to genocide. Martin Luther King, in that very letter, he said, people say that I'm an extremist, but let us be an extremist of love and not an extremist of hate. People of all backgrounds, let's unite together. Extremists of love in this election, a victory resounding, hand in hand as we see each other here in Dearborn and in the glimmering cities of Milwaukee, in Phoenix and Atlanta, to ensure that our great, great, great grandchildren will remember us and valorize us. One day there will be a course, 21st century American history. Turn to page 79, dear brothers and sisters. Turn to page 79. For the classroom, grade 9, grade 10, the teacher coming in, the hands go up. The question is, how was it that the American people in 2024 voted for the vice president? That for them, the images are so evident, the genocide. For them, no different than Jim Crow and segregation and slavery. Foreign policy, we should have civil rights for all people, not just Americans, the dream of Martin Luther King. For those students in that class 40, 50 years from now in America, they will valorize those people from all backgrounds, their image in that textbook, those people who said no to waiting, who followed the promise, the words in that letter by Martin Luther King. Let's stop waiting. Otherwise, we fall further down on that slope, that slippery slope. And let's say end the evil, the genocide, the attacks, the rain of munitions, the bombardments. Let's end it at our hands, finally.
Well put. You know, I have to say, Doctor, we appreciate throughout this entire campaign all the time you all have been willing to give us here from on the freedom side from Abandon Harris. So Dr. Hassan Abdel Salam, Director of the Abandon Harris campaign, thanks so much for being with us once again here on the freedom side.
Pleasure, amazing to be with you. Two people of conscience speaking the truth. Thanks so much for the service as we move towards these last days.
Right on. Rania?
Well, Eugene, I think it's going to be interesting. The next time we do a show like this, it'll be election night. Should we tell people about that?
We should tell people about that. That's a great point that you make. We will be back with you sooner than normal next Tuesday. I guess that's November 5th, Election Day in the United States, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Or is it Eastern Time? I can never remember which one it is. Either way, 8 p.m. on the East Coast. It's not exactly the same. 8 p.m. on the East Coast, we will be here live. We will be discussing everything going on. We'll be giving you the results. We've got an in-studio panel. We've got great guests that are going to be joining us. How long will we be going? Well, you're just going to have to tune in and see, because we're going to try to go with the rhythm of the night, if you will. Sorry, I didn't see that one coming. And just whatever is happening. Obviously, who knows? You remember 2020, people were challenging the election already that night. So we'll try to stick with it into the early hours of the morning if we have to. Rania Khalek will be in Dearborn, Michigan, joining us virtually from there, and also doing some reporting in the coming days, over the next few days, in the lead up to the election from one of the major areas for the story. So live November 5th, election night. We'll start at 8. I'll be here. Rania will be here. We'll have Katie Halper with us. We'll have Amanda Yee with us. I think we have Brianna Joy Gray with us. We should have some of the third-party presidential candidates. I think we will have Jill Stein, Claudia De La Cruz, and Cornel West at different points in the show, who will also be with us. We'll have Davon Love from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We'll have Jessica Mason-Piclo helping us break down everything happening with the abortion referendums that are happening all across the country. I mean, we're going to have so much. I'm leaving so many people out. You have no idea. We're the producer of this show is going insane, I think, because we're making so many demands of who should be on this show, so that you can have something that is,
we love you, Emily,
even more comparable, greater than CNN. You won't have to listen to Van Jones. You won't have to listen to Rachel Maddow. You won't have to listen to whoever is on Fox this year. I guess Harris Faulkner. I don't know who's doing their show. Anyway,
welcome.
Yes.
You're welcome to all of our audience, our listeners and viewers out there. You are very welcome, that we are going to give you an alternative to the circus that is the mainstream media. But most importantly, you can help support our amazing coverage. And as Eugene said, I will be coming to you from Dearborn, Michigan. So keep your eye out throughout the next few days ahead of the election for some reporting on what's happening on the ground with the Arab American community there in the lead up to this election. Make sure you're following us on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, so you can catch the interesting stuff we will be putting out. But if you do appreciate the fact that we are giving you an alternative to Van Jones and Rachel Maddow and Jake Tapper, then please go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and help support our important endeavor so you don't lose your mind by becoming a patron of Breakthrough News for as little as $5 a month, where you can access exclusive content and exclusive merch. And like I said, most importantly, helping us make that sort of coverage happen.
Yeah, it's going to be great. You won't be getting Tom Brokaw with his glasses the one time he comes on NBC every year now. NBC Nightly News, Tom Brokaw. Anyway, long story short, it's going to be great. Going to be a great show. I'm really excited to see what we're going to get from Dearborn. We're going to actually let that be a little bit of a surprise. We've got some great stuff lined up there that we will be bringing you. So, as always, that brings us to the end of the show. Big shout out to everyone who listened. Big shout out to all our guests. Big shout out to the whole Breakthrough News team that made it possible, including... I don't know. I think he has a camera in there. John Preisner, who runs the show behind the scenes, has a great Halloween costume today, by the way. You won't be able to see it, but nonetheless, just shouting him out for the spirit of the season. Also, Rachel, who provided our office today with quite a number of great Halloween treats. So the Breakthrough team, very festive. Great job. Shout out to you here on air. We thank you all. And we will see you next Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time.